Thank you. Your Honour, leave has been granted to my friend to appear for Tasmania, who's at the bar table today.
Thank you.
If I can introduce the panel. First we have Megan Mitchell, who's the National Children's Commissioner with the Australian Human Rights Commission. Karen Boland, who's the Children's Guardian in New South Wales. And Pam Simmons, who's the Guardian in South Australia.
Thank you.
Perhaps, Ms Mitchell, if I can ask you to rise for the oath or affirmation to be administered.
Ms Mitchell, do you prefer the oath or the affirmation?
The affirmation, please.
Thank you. Could you repeat after me, please? I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you, Ms Mitchell. Ms Boland, do you prefer the oath or the affirmation?
The oath, Your Honour.
The oath?
Yes.
Would you mind taking the Bible, please?
No.
And repeating after me, I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
In
this Royal
Commission.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth. Thank you. You can take a seat. This is the oath or the affirmation?
The affirmation, please.
Thank you. Could you repeat after me, please? I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you, Ms Sims. Take a seat, please.
Thank you, Your Honour. Ms Boland, can I start with you? Would you tell the Royal Commission what your functions are as a children's guardian with respect to children in out-of-home care and the system by which out-of-home care is delivered in New South Wales?
Yes. The Children's Guardian is established as an independent statutory position with an office that reports directly to her. It's an agency that's separate from FACS, which is Family and Community Services, but it does sit in that cluster for administrative purposes.
I'm sorry, it does sit within that cluster. Do you mean under the broad umbrella?
Under the broad administrative arrangements of government, but the position reports directly to the Minister for Family and Community Services and to a Parliamentary Joint Committee of Children and Young People. The primary purpose of the role is to promote the best interests of children and young people in out-of-home care and ensure that their rights are safeguarded. So that's the underpinning driver and that drives all of our functions. The key functions for the purposes of out-of-home care are in relation to an accreditation program that we run for non-government and government agencies which provide out-of-home care. We also provide accreditation program for adoption services. We have a voluntary accreditation services scheme, and we have a scheme of accreditation, and it's a voluntary scheme for child sex offender counsellors. We also administer the Working with Children check, and since June 15 we administer a carers register which collects information on authorised carers and supported carers in New South Wales. They're the main functions in relation to out-of-home care. There are others.
Just in relation to the carers register, how did that come about? The carers register was first proposed in about 2011. It arose out of discussions about probity, a probity roundtable, in fact, that the Ombudsman's Office had pulled together, and discussions about carers moving from one agency to another agency, being deauthorised or having matters that hadn't been resolved in one agency, then moving to another agency and being authorised.
It then became imperative that the carers register be put in place with the transition of out-of-home care from the government sector to the non-government sector, because there was no centralised database of carers and household members at that point in time. So we have been working to establish that system over the last couple of years, and I'm happy to say that it went live on June 15 of this year.
The carers that are within your database are carers that you have been told of from the various agencies that you accredit to provide out-of-home care services?
Yes, and from FACS. So it covers all carers across the whole sector.
And when you say as from FACS, is FACS an accredited out-of-home care provider?
It's interim accredited.
The database contains the name of the carer and the agency with which they're associated. Is that right?
That's correct.
What else?
The carers register is focused around a household, and the underlying principle of that is really a child needs a safe home for life. So it isn't really just about a carers and their authorisation. It looks more broadly at the environment in which a child will play, so a child or young person. So it does look at household members, and it does have certain requirements for household members as well as authorised carers.
Household members, as we know, change from time to time. How are those changes picked up?
There is a responsibility for agencies to notify their designated agents, for carers to notify designated agencies of a change of household member. There's currently actually a bill before the Parliament which is currently being considered, which makes it a requirement for authorised carers to notify their agency of a change within 3 weeks of that happening.
And presumably if that change involves a new adult member of the household, there'll be a requirement for a working with children check.
That's correct.
With
This is foster carers and kinship carers.
Supported carers. So
Is there a difference?
Payment. So if you are an authorised carer, statutory care or in supported care, then you will be registered on the carers register. So supported care in New South Wales is where you receive a payment.
So does that mean that some kinship carers will not come within that criteria?
Private arrangements won't come within the criteria.
But any arrangement that comes through FACS will?
Yes.
or FACS or a designated agency?
Or a designated agency, which is fundamentally an NGO provider of out-of-home care services.
So, in fact, the vast majority of kinship carers would come within the definition
Yes.
of authorised carers.
Yes.
They're authorised by the designated agency, that is the agency which has selected them to provide services. Is that right? That's who the authorisation comes from?
The register is established so that the designated agency or the provider of out-of-home care enters certain information on the register. So it has each designated agency or out-of-home care provider has a login, and then they log in and they start from the very beginning, the application, and there's a series of steps that you need to go through, a series of checks that need to occur, and at the end of that, that carer will be given an authorisation number. So it has some characteristics of a licensing system, if you like, and that number then authorises the carer to provide care for the provider, the designated agency.
Does anyone, particularly in your organisation, check those details and make an assessment whether the person should be authorised?
The carers register is really in relation to, its fundamental is to encourage people and agencies in particular to exchange information. So the register itself It says whether a household inspection's happened. It looks to the whether everyone has a working with children check, whether authorised carers have a national police check, 2 referees, and there's a series of criteria like that, which must be met. Household members also have to meet criteria, as do children in the household over 16. And that also includes what we're calling a community services check, which is a check of the holdings of FACS, Family and Community Services.
When you say they must be met, who determines whether they have been met?
The agency determines that, so that they're in charge of doing the household and making the assessment that the household's suitable. We have guidelines and criteria in relation to referee reports, a national police record. The way that we then ensure that that happens is via our compliance program, which is in the accreditation area.
I see. So the information they provide and the authorisation they give ultimately can be considered by you in the broader question of accrediting them as an out-of-home care provider.
Yes, absolutely.
You described it as akin to a licensing system. In a licensing system, you usually have an independent body that determines a criteria against which someone will be judged and then assesses whether that criteria is being met. It doesn't quite get that far, does it?
No, and I did use the term advisedly. It's got characteristics of a licensing system. Just to underscore the real importance of the system is that it really is to encourage agencies to exchange information. So there will be certain flags on the register which also require you to contact another designated agency. Sorry, I should have said really importantly, one of the key checks is if you log in and the name is already there and that name is attached to another designated agency, there's a requirement that you pick up the phone and make inquiries from that other designated agency as to the credentials or otherwise of the authorised carer.
So, Ms. Boland, who has access to that register?
The OCG have, we do. The Ombudsman has access, and all designated agencies have access to the register when they're in the process of registering someone. So they can't, the designated agencies can't surf the system, so to speak. They have access that's relevant to them.
But isn't that the point? That they can look to see whether there's a carer that's already been authorised and what their circumstances
That's
are?
absolutely the point. I was really trying to emphasise that there are restrictions. You just can't go in and look for anybody. You have to be in the process of someone having made an application with your agency.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. So an application's made, you look up that person's name to see if they're already there.
Yes.
If they're not, you enter their details.
Yes.
And someone else can only look up that person's name if they've got an application.
That's right.
And they do so by way of a login,
A login.
which provides some audit trail,
That's right.
if necessary.
Yes.
And that works as part of the whole system of accreditation.
That's right.
It's a bit early to say how it's going, but how is it going?
Well, it only started a few weeks ago, but in terms of and I think it's one of the fundamentals about introducing systems into the sector, is that they have to be seen to support and provide a real and valuable service in order for them to be used properly. So we have spent a significant amount of time working with the sector and the agencies in establishing the register, and we feel that we have significant buy-in and that it is a truly useful support tool for agencies. So from that perspective, it's been a success so far. There's some real challenges ahead, obviously, while people enter current carers, and they've got till September to do that. I think by about this time next year we'll have a really good idea about how it's going and whether it's achieving its purpose. And its primary purpose is obviously to make sure that
carers and household members meet minimum requirements to be carers and have children and young people in their care, but also that there is a information exchange occurs across agencies in a free-flowing and open fashion. And
We
that's
might
its
have you
primary
back, Ms.
purpose.
Boland, in a year's time to tell us how you're going. You also mentioned some sort of register, I think, about child sex offender counsellors.
We run a voluntary accreditation scheme in relation to child sex offender counsellors, and that's been in place for a number of years. And as I said, it's a voluntary system. We have a panel of experts. People make application to be accredited, and there are criteria that they have to meet in terms of their qualifications, their supervision, and the training that they've taken over the time of their voluntary accreditation. When they're accredited, they're put on our website, and we understand that then those names or those persons or companies are used for the purposes of court reports, but that kind of function.
Is it primarily that function of court reporting?
Yeah, or in child protection matters.
Do you have any idea as to the take-up of that involvement, given that it's voluntary?
No, we did. No, not with any accuracy.
But
No. We did we reviewed the system a year ago to look at its viability and its usability, and whether in fact sitting it with the children's guardian was the best place for it, or whether it would get, I suppose, better traction in another area. The result of that was that generally people were very happy to have it. They thought it was a valuable thing, and we continue to have discussions with people about how to strengthen that, because at the moment, as you say, it's voluntary. Yeah.
can you explain a bit about the accreditation scheme you have for out-of-home care providers?
So the New South Wales accreditation system's been in place for over a decade. It is a unique system in Australia in that we have a set of out-of-home care standards. Those standards had their origin in voluntary standards, which were developed by the non-government sector and then the Department for Community Services. They came into operation with an accreditation system in 2003. What the system does, and I think it's really important to understand, people think often it is a point-in-time assessment of an agency. It is far from a point-in-time assessment of an agency. We like to say it's an ongoing process. Once you're accredited, there's an expectation that you maintain standards, and we have a number of, I suppose, regulatory tools that we use to remain engaged with agencies over the life of the 5-year accreditation, and indeed for re-accreditation we have a number of audit tools also. I think the fundamental about the system is that it's gone through a number of iterations. It's changed, obviously. It's moved from what would have been called a compliance-based system into what's now called a risk-based system, and we really focus on strengths. So the best description, I think, is to say that when we go into an agency, our focus is on the child or young person. So when we look at an agency, we start there. So we look to see how a child and young person is faring, whether their views are heard, whether they're participating, are their health and education needs met, are there other particular issues that are required, are any allegations in relation to their care being dealt with properly. So we look at it from the child's perspective, from
from how they're experiencing care, and then we make an assessment about whether that agency meets the standards. So when we talk about child focused, I think that's the practical way in which we do that. We don't just do that with case files, and I recall the young people on Monday talking about barcodes and case files. We don't consider children to be case files, and therefore we spend a lot of time with staff and often with children and young people, with supervisors, so that we have a very solid understanding about how an agency understands and accommodates the needs of children and young people. So we've seen some exceptional practice. I'm just thinking one recently where the principal officer, and the principal officer is the person in charge of all out-of-home care within that agency, knew every single one of the 150 children and did know exactly what was happening with them, and that was not just at her level but through the organisation. And I think that's the kind of organisation that we aim to have.
You spoke of regulatory tools available to you to assist in the assessment throughout the 5-year life of the accreditation. What are they?
So we have what we call a risk management tool. So if something comes to our attention, and there are some requirements that agencies tell us about things, and there's also, obviously, we get information from the Ombudsman and from FACS. Things like the removal of a CEO, the leaving of a CEO, disruptions at the board level, principal officers or a lack of principal officer, those kinds of things would trigger our interest, and we would go to the agency and we would have a look at what was happening and then put in a risk plan, work with them over the life of the risk plan and make sure that the risks were mitigated and that the agency was back in balance, so to speak. So that's one tool. Where we get information that suggests in particular areas that the performance of an agency is falling below what we would expect and want, we will go back in and work with them over time with a performance, what we call a performance management plan.
Where will that information come from typically?
About performance? Typically it comes from the Ombudsman. We work very closely with the Ombudsman and have information exchange in relation to that.
And is the information coming to the Ombudsman from complaints being made?
It comes from complaints or investigations or systemic reviews that they might do. The other source of information would be FACS itself, would indicate that there was a particular issue happening in this agency. I should also say that our contact with agencies is very intense, so they are also likely to let us know that they've experienced some issues or some problems. So the ones that I spoke about before are typical. We do hear very quickly if there's disruptions at a board level, or we do hear very quickly if a CEO's gone, or a replacement, or there's some kind of issue like that.
What about complaints from children and young people?
In New South Wales, the complaints jurisdiction, and including for children and young people, is with the Ombudsman.
Yes.
Yeah. And we would, and again, the Ombudsman would let us know if there was a series of issues or complaints, and we would go back and have a look at that agency and see what was happening. In relation to our accreditation scheme, we, as part of our processes, look at the complaint handling and consultation processes that are in place for children and young people within agencies, so that is part of the accreditation criteria, and they have to be clear, and we would look at and follow up complaints to make sure that they're being dealt with appropriately. We look quite a lot at consultation and participation systems that agencies have in place, and they are various, and a lot of them are very good.
What can you say to us about the features of those systems that you classify as very good?
The ones that they're so various, but a couple that I can tell you about are consultation forums. It sounds formal, but they're kind of quite relaxed, bringing together of kids in the care of the agency.
This is the agency doing
Yes,
that?
this is the agency. So we'll look at what the agency does. We've observed some of these as well. They'll bring together the kids and they will have a structured environment, but there's plenty of time for raising issues. What we look at from that is what issues are raised by individual children. Are they then followed up with the agency, and how are they followed up? So that's one example. There's other examples where a survey mechanism's used, and surveying how kids are feeling and faring in the care of that particular organisation. And again, we would follow up about what the outcomes of those surveys are and what was happening. Thank you.
Sorry, could I just ask one question? It relates to complaints. Since your last appearance at the Commission, there's been the establishment of the Advocate for Children and Young People as a replacement for some of the functions performed by the previous Commission for Children and Young People. What's the interface between this new body, the Advocate for Children and Young People, and your office, if any?
The Advocate is in the process of developing a statewide plan for children and young people, so we have interaction in relation to children in out-of-home care and what that plan might look like, and what particular gaps exist across the government service. That's an ongoing process for the Advocate, so that's the kind of interface that we have with the Advocate.
Is the Advocate, does it have only a systemic advocacy role, or does it have an individual advocacy role, to your knowledge?
Systemic.
Okay. So it's unlikely that body would in fact bring forward complaints that have been from children or individual people within the care system?
I suspect it will be the same as the previous system, where those complaints would be referred to an ombudsman. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
With the 5-year accreditation system, is there a formal process whereby you review on a periodic basis their performance? You've spoken about...
Oh, sorry. We do what we call compliance audits. It used to be called case file audits. So we used to do what we called go in and look at case files against certain criteria, give the feedback to the agency about what those files look like. A number of years ago we moved away from that process into a more interactive process based on particular areas of interest, where we felt that we needed to get a firmer grip on what was happening in relation to kids in out-of-home care. So we undertook 2 audits, one in relation to education and one in relation to health. The more recent, and in fact the ongoing compliance audits that we're doing at the moment, is we're looking at children under 12 in residential facilities. In New South Wales, there is a policy, government policies, that says that children under 12 should not be in a residential facility. There are exceptions to that, and I think one of the one particular area is in sibling groups, where you'll see groups of siblings go into a residential because of the difficulty in placing them in foster care. So we're just in the final throes of finishing that particular one, and the next part of that will be to look at, second part of the audit is to look at governance, and in particular we're looking at
how a board comes to understand what's actually happening in their agency for which they're responsible. So one of the significant issues for us is, does the board understand its responsibilities? How does it inform itself of its responsibilities? And then how does it affect change in an agency when it needs to? So they're the kinds of things that we're looking at in this next compliance audit.
And that's a compliance audit of all accredited agencies.
Yes.
You said that there is a parliamentary committee to which you report from time to time or engage with. Are there any other oversight mechanisms of your work?
In relation to the standards are developed. I should have mentioned that the standards are currently being reworked to amalgamate the adoption and the out-of-home care standards into one set of standards. Those standards are on recommendation by the Children's Guardian to the Minister. The Minister must approve that and the criteria for accreditation. And the Joint Parliamentary Committee oversights, if you like, the Working with Children check and those activities.
Does the Ombudsman have any jurisdiction over your work?
The Ombudsman oversights our work like everyone else. So, yes.
So as a public agency,
yes,
if a person wanted to make a complaint about the operations of your agency, they'd go to the Ombudsman like anyone else in relation to a public agency?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms Simmons, you're the Guardian in South Australia. How long have you held that position?
Over 10 years.
Are you the first Guardian?
I am.
And only Guardian?
Yes, as far as I know.
I hope you'd know. What are your functions and responsibilities in relation to children in out-of-home care?
The Guardian is first and foremost an advocate for children who are under the guardianship of the Minister, and primarily for those who are in out-of-home care. The three critical roles of the Guardian is to monitor the circumstances of children who are under the guardianship of the Minister, and to investigate or inquire into issues of concern. And the third area is to advocate for the reform or change that's needed. That can be done for an individual child, or it can be done on a systemic level. The monitoring activity that we conduct that's probably of most relevance to this commission is that we do conduct monitoring visits to some residential care agencies to talk to children and to view their records. The second monitoring activity of most relevance is that we follow the progress of investigations of allegations of serious sexual abuse of children who are in out-of-home care. And the third area is that we track the individual inquiries that come to our office to look for any patterns or the profile of children or agencies that they might be involved in.
Just in terms of the monitoring, how do you determine which child or agency you go to and the frequency with which you visit?
In relation to residential care visits?
Firstly, yes.
Because there are probably 6 or 7 years ago we would visit all the residential care units, but there's been a significant expansion of residential care use in South Australia, so we're not able to visit every unit now. We visit about a third in each year, and we do that. We decide which ones we're going to visit on the basis of how vulnerable we believe the children to be. We use a matrix.
The younger the children, or the cohort of children, the more vulnerable?
Potentially, but it's probably more likely to be the larger the unit, for example, the greater number of children, if they're accommodating children with much higher need. If there have been concerns raised about that agency that's running the residential care unit or that unit itself. Even in the previous year, we've done a visit and had some concerns. We will visit again to follow up that the recommendations we've made have been implemented. So in that case, we prioritise the visits that we do.
Why has there been an expansion in children in residential care?
Because there's been a shortage of family-based care.
So the response to that has been to the state to set up and run residential care?
The state and non-government organisations, yes. So they're both the government and non-government run residential care units. About 2/3 of those children who are in residential care are in government-run facilities, and about 1/3 are in non-government.
Do you take an interest, because you must, in the staffing of residential care facilities?
Certainly interest in the ratios of staff to residents, yes.
What about the permanency of staff?
Permanency and skills. So one of the things that we look at in our, we also do an annual survey of all residential care facilities, and we ask for answers to questions such as staff to resident ratios, the number of permanent and casual staff, the training that's provided to staff. So we ask a number of questions of all of the units. We put that together into one report, but we only visit 1/3 of the agencies. So yes, we do take an interest in the skills, the training, the staff ratios, the permanency of the staff who are working in residential care.
What monitoring do you do in relation to children in foster care?
The monitoring is not nearly as active or proactive, so a lot does rely on people coming forward with concerns about a child. This is the, if you like, the individual advocacy that we're able to do. So if somebody is concerned about a child, or a child themselves who is in foster care is unhappy, they contact our office. We then make inquiries about the matter and can investigate further if we need to.
What about kinship care?
And the same in kinship care. So unfortunately it's very reliant on people coming forward to us with issues and concerns. We don't do much more active monitoring and fostering kinship care.
You spoke of monitoring investigations. Who conducts the investigations that you monitor?
We monitor, if you're talking about investigations of allegations of serious sexual abuse, perhaps if I explain the process.
Certainly.
So the allegations of serious sexual abuse would usually go to the Child Abuse Report Line, which is run by the department. If it is about a child who's in out-of-home care, that notification is usually sent to the department's, what's called the Care Concerns Investigation Unit. Within a very short period of time, if it's a serious sexual abuse matter and there's potentially a criminal basis to that, they refer that notification to the police, and at the same time they provide us with the notification. At that point we register that notification has been received. We then attend where we can. We attend the initial planning meeting about what is to happen about that investigation, who is to do what. Our role at that planning meeting is to ensure that there is an advocate for the child. So we're looking for somebody who has a relationship with the child, is independent, of course, of the allegation, and is able to support the child through the process of investigation. We then call together the police and the Care Concerns Investigation Unit every 3 months. We require them to report to us on the progress of the investigation. The aim is to ensure that, firstly, that the child is supported through the investigation, but secondly, that the investigation is conducted in a timely manner. And so we then continue to monitor those investigations until they are concluded, and then we register whatever the conclusion is. At present, we're undertaking analysis of that information. We commenced this function in November 2008. We're doing an analysis of the information from November 2008 to October 2014, so over a 6-year period. We'll be looking at, unfortunately that information isn't available to me yet, but I think there's over 250 matters that we'll be looking at involving something a bit over 380 children.
So I take it from that then, in that 6-year period, you've had, or the department has received, over 250 notifications which involve serious child sexual abuse of a child in out-of-home care that has come to your attention, and that involves just under 400 children.
That's right.
that study will tell you the outcomes, I take it, of those investigations?
It will tell us the outcomes. It will tell us the timeliness of those investigations as well. It will give us a profile of the circumstances, the nature of the allegation, in what circumstances the child was in as well. I can give you a basic and breakdown of the types of care that the children are in those 250.
So just before you do that, I take it you keep data on an annual basis as well?
Yes, we report in our annual report on that data, yes. Yeah.
Well, perhaps you can tell us whatever data you have to hand that will provide a picture of the system.
Certainly. So, and this is in relation to the serious sexual abuse allegations.
That's
yes.
Right.
So 41% of those of those children, or the incidents rather, were in foster care. 34% were in residential care. 17% in relative or kinship care. 5% were in emergency care, and 3% were in the youth justice detention facility. We also have a mandate to monitor the circumstances for children and young people who are detained in the youth justice facility, regardless of whether they're under guardianship of the minister.
Just let me stop you there. Are those percentages you've told us representative of the children who are in those types of care? Is it proportionate?
No, there's a disproportionate number, of course, who are in residential care. The breakdown is basically in South Australia, it's between 12 and 13% of all children are in residential care.
Compared with 34% were the subject of an allegation.
That's correct.
Yes.
41% are in foster care, and 45% are in kinship care. There are some qualifications, I think, about the higher rate, or perhaps explanations for the higher rate in residential care. That is that there's likely to be a higher reporting of incidents in residential care, and it's also likely to be that the children who are accommodated, many more, will have higher needs than those in foster care. But regardless, you have to be concerned about that disproportion.
You would expect also, wouldn't you, that there'd be a lower reporting rate for children in kinship care?
That's right, yes, yeah.
In residential care in South Australia, do you accommodate children who have sexually abusive behaviours?
Yes, they do.
And there's no particular arrangements in place for those children when placed in a residential facility with other children?
Yes, there are. Children can be placed on their own if they are a significant threat to other children. So they can be placed on their own. They're not always placed on their own.
Of the statistics you've told us, are you able to say who was the alleged perpetrator of the sexual abuse?
We will be able to. I can't tell you that information today. We did do some analysis on child abuse, particularly in residential care, because of a concern about what was happening there, which is pretty basic, but I'm very happy to just run through that if that's helpful. It was done in the context of South Australia having some large residential, what I call large residential facilities, so they accommodate between 8 to 12 children and young people. These were mostly built in the 1980s, but the 3 more were built recently in the last 5 years. This, I have to say, is contrary to my recommendation. Since 2005, I recommended the closure of the large residential facilities.
We'll come back to why you recommended that, but continue.
So to test my argument about the lack of safety in the large residential facilities, I looked at data on missing person reports, on the use of physical restraint, and on allegations of serious sexual abuse in residential care and in foster care and kinship care. 23.6% of the notifications of serious sexual abuse were reported to involve at least one resident in the larger facilities.
Sorry, this is 23% of the complaints in residential care.
That's right.
Yes.
It will be easier, and I've got copies here to provide you with the charts because that gives a vivid illustration of the risk, the higher risk for children who are in the larger residential care units as well as in residential care.
If you do provide that, we will gratefully receive it, but perhaps you could continue with your percentages.
So the children in the larger residential facilities were involved in 23.6% of those incidents, but over the same period they represented only 2.8% of the whole out-of-home care population. Of the 92 notifications of child-on-child abuse, this is serious sexual abuse, I should say, 44 occurred in the large residential facilities, so almost 50% of the child-on-child abuse occurred in the large residential facilities. There have been 365 individual children involved in those 225 notifications. Of those 365 children, 46.8% were in family-based care, 32.1% were in the larger residential care units, and 9.6% were in other forms of residential care. Of the 365 individual children, 30 were involved in multiple notifications, so there was more than one notification over that period of time of serious sexual abuse. 14 of those 30 were living in the large residential care units. So I did that analysis to support or to test, I suppose, my thoughts and anecdotal information that the children were unsafe in the large residential care units.
What do you think it is about the way those large residential care units operate that make children unsafe?
There's a lower staff to resident ratio, that the children, you have children influencing each other. Mostly, I would have to say, it has more of an institutional feel to it, but because it is the staff to resident ratio, which is the problem, so the supervision of the children is much harder. Of course, you have to take into account that the higher needs children were accommodated, and the high needs children were increasingly accommodated in the larger residential care units, which from my point of view defies logic. Because if you've got higher need children, they need more attention, not less. And so that continued to be the way where higher need children were accommodated in the larger residential facilities.
You indicated earlier that your interest in the residential facilities was in the ratio of workers to children. Is it not the case that you can't, throughout your functions, indicate to the government or the NGO who runs the facility that you believe that the ratio should be different?
And I have made many recommendations over that time. Yes, eventually. To be fair now, the department and the minister have accepted that continuing to operate the large residential facilities is not the way to go. Let me see, 12 months ago we had 9 large facilities. We now have 6. They've closed 3 of the older facilities. We still have 6 that are operating. As far as I know, the intention is to continue to either close them or put them to some other use. So I'll be waiting to see on that.
Where are the children now who are in the facilities which have closed?
They're accommodated, well, most of them will be accommodated in other forms of residential care. So they're residential care of 3 and 4 children rather than 8 to 12 children.
So they're still in residential care, but in a smaller unit.
Some would be in family, have moved to family-based care. Some might have returned to family. I'm not sure the detail of where those children have gone. I expect most will have gone to another form of residential care, but I can't be certain of that.
So is it your experience that in the smaller units of residential care, the ratio of staff to child is higher?
Yes, it is, yes. It's, by comparison, it's about 1 to 2, 1 staff member to 2 residents in the smaller units. whereas it's 1.1 to 3.5. So in other words, 1 staff member for every 3 to 4 in the larger units. And overnight, the average is 1 to 9. So you have 1 staff member and 9 residents overnight in the larger units.
There's been reference this week to stand-up workers in residential care, which presumably means somebody's awake at night. The 1 to 9 that you've referred to, is that person expected to be awake?
I would expect they would be. I can't be sure about that, but I would fully expect that they would be awake. There also is an on-call system as well, so if there is an incident or need for another staff member, there is somebody on call to come to the unit.
What's your view of the adequacy of a ratio of 1 to 9 at night?
It's highly inadequate.
Because the children will quite likely have challenging behaviours, won't they?
That's correct. But of course the inadequacy is actually housing 9 residents in one place.
But you wouldn't expect them to sleep from 9 to 7 like perhaps other children might sleep.
No.
And I take it you've made that view known.
Yes.
Could I just ask this question? You indicated before that in relation to residential care, you visit about a third per year. Who else visits? Is it only the department, or is there a community visitor program operating in South Australia?
In relation to children who are in out-of-home care under guardianship of the Minister in residential care. No, the department licenses, I should say they license the non-government residential care units, and they do an inspection of their own facilities now, which has only just commenced. And so there is that, which is much more about the physical facility and the policies and procedures. In relation to visiting children, there is no community visitor program as such for visiting children who are under guardianship and in residential care. The community visitor can, but their focus is on disability and mental health consumers and residents of facilities rather than children. So residents of facilities that we don't visit largely do not get an independent visitor.
Thank you.
You've spoken of your functions in monitoring and following investigations. Any other functions that are relevant to out-of-home care?
Yes, promotion of safety, and rights of children. So we have a major role in ensuring that children in out-of-home care understand what their rights are and that they have the right to be safe. We do that primarily through products to children. I'll leave this with you. This is the 23 range of products that we have to be distributed to children, which emphasise their rights, who they should contact if they want to speak to somebody, and primarily their right to be safe. There's a safety symbol, which is a small creature called OOG, stands for Office of the Guardian, but they know the creature as OOG. It's a secret symbol for children who are in out-of-home care, and the emphasis of OOG is your right to be safe. And so all of the products, again, emphasise that and who they should contact if they feel unsafe or unhappy or distressed.
Is that being taken up, Ms Simmons?
It has, in a major way.
What sort of numbers?
Well, all children in out-of-home care should have, and mostly will have received some products.
Sorry, that was a clumsy question. You indicated that the offer was open to make contact, so my question was about, is the contact being made?
Thank you, Your Honour. I understand better now that in relation to the calls that come to our office, about anywhere between a fifth and a quarter probably are from children and young people themselves. Overall, though, the calls to our office aren't massive. There's about 140 matters in any 1 year that we would record as something that we would need to look into, and about, as I said, about anywhere between 20% and 25% would be coming from children themselves.
And the nature of those contacts, are they about safety?
A significant number are about safety. There's also concerns about placement as well, is the other major issue. For children, it's often about their involvement in decisions and feeling disempowered by things that are happening to them.
There's a council for the care of children in South Australia. How does that fit with your work?
The Council for the Care of Children has a much broader mandate for all children and young people in South Australia. It's an advisory function to the Minister about the circumstances, but the promotion of well-being and concerns, particularly for groups of vulnerable children. So yes, they do have an interest, of course, in what is happening to children in out-of-home care, but they also have an interest in other vulnerable groups of children. They do an excellent job of involving people in discussion, exchange of ideas and recommendations to the Minister about what should happen to children as a whole, or what is happening and what could happen.
You heard Ms Boland speak about what her functions are in New South Wales. Just dealing firstly with the function of accreditation, I take it that's not something that your agency does?
Yes, thank you for that question, because I meant to say the differences. The similarities are that we are both statutory independent officers, and the other similarity is that we're mostly interested in how children and young people experience the system, so our focus is very much on what is happening to the children and young people. The differences for the Guardian in South Australia from the New South Wales Guardian is that we don't do accreditation of agencies, we don't do working with children checks, and we don't have a carers register.
Have those matters been subject to consideration in your office?
No, if only because the functions that we have take up a lot of our capacity. If the question is, would it be considered in the future that maybe that the government may consider that the Guardian could have a role in that, it can be very difficult to mix being an advocate for a child, though, with, in fact, probably impossible, to being the advocate for the child and also being a regulatory authority. I don't think those roles mix too well. We are partisan in our intervention. We are partisan on behalf of the child. The child alone is our client. It is not the caller to the office. We are only an advocate for the child. And again, there's similarities there, but I think the way we carry out our functions is very different.
In terms of South Australia's structure, do you think that creating a body separate from an advocacy body like yours, with the functions that Ms Boland has spoken of in terms of accreditation, working with children check and various registers, would improve the safety of children in your state?
I do think you've got to look at the independence of how those functions are carried out. Whether you want to create another independent statutory office is certainly up for debate. From my point of view, it matters less what the oversight body is and much more about how independent it is, its proximity to children and hearing from children, what its critical focus is, rather than what sort of oversight body you have. I think the closer that an oversight body can be to hearing from children, the stronger it is. It certainly needs the right resources to be able to do what it needs to do. So all of the things that have been talked about are very important, and I think that there needs to be accountability for those and some independence, but I'm not sure it needs to be done by an independent statutory body. There would be arguments both ways with that. In South Australia, the accreditation isn't done. It's rather a licensing system and provide a panel within the department.
So the department provides the accreditation, whatever language you...
That's correct.
describe.
That's correct. And same with the Working with Children checks is actually done through another department. From the Education and Child Development Department does the licensing and inspection of facilities and the licensing of out-of-home care agencies. The Department for Communities and Social Inclusion does the screening function for those, employment screening function for those who have applied for positions, or as carers, they do the screening. And then the screening report is then provided back to the department who does the carer registration. So the carer registration is also done by the department.
Is there a database similar to the one Ms Boland described?
Yes, there is.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. We'll
Thank you.
come back to the broader issues.
Thank you.
Ms Mitchell, your position hasn't been in place for that long. Is that right?
That's correct. I had the role for 2.5 years, and it's the first of its kind of National Children's Commissioner.
What are your functions in relation to children in out-of-home care?
Well, as National Commissioner, my statutory duties involve being a national advocate for and promoting the awareness of the rights and interests of children. I also have a statutory function to report to Federal Parliament every year on matters relating to children's rights. The statute that governs my role also provides that I pay particular attention to the situation of vulnerable and marginalised children, and as the Honourable Commissioners well know, institutions and institutional arrangements are inherently risky for children, and so children in out-of-home care are a particularly vulnerable group that I am concerned about, especially at a national level.
Mm-hmm. Because, of course, it's a state-based responsibility.
It is a state-based responsibility, and as you have heard, there are different systems and arrangements and protective safeguards around the country, which obviously provides a different nature and level of protection to children depending on where they live. Mm-hmm. And that's something, obviously, that I'd like to see change. I think that all children, especially these very vulnerable children, should have the highest quality of care possible, and that they shouldn't be disadvantaged because of where they happen to live in Australia.
We'll come back to that. There's a national framework in place.
There certainly is. So despite all these differences, and some of them do provide useful, have come historically about because of local needs, so we can't dismiss those differences either. And as you've heard, some states have broad-based advocacy roles, others have, in terms of child protection and care systems, others focus on advocacy and oversight for individual children, like the one in South Australia, also in the ACT and also in Queensland. So it'd be very interesting, I think, in this forum to talk about the benefits of those models. I personally agree with Ms Simmons that we need to build oversight systems that are as close to the child as possible and that allow individual and agencies or authorities or people or advocates who can follow the progress and review the progress of individual children. That is the only way I think we can assure their safety at an individual level.
Just coming back to the national framework,
yes,
how does that work?
Well, it's been in place since 2009, work on this framework, and it is a platform whereby states and territories have agreed to come together to improve and standardise in some cases their approach to out-of-home care, and should I also say early intervention and prevention, although we haven't really got to that yet, even though really you would have thought that was the sort of the fundamental building block for a system that protects children. And on that score, we're up to the third action plan in relation to the framework.
Have the first two action plans been implemented?
There have been certain gains through the framework, including national standards for out-of-home care. The extent to which these have been implemented in the jurisdictions is unclear. And we also have improvements in consistency in the consistency and collection of administrative data, and that has occurred over time to the point that we now have the capacity for unit record data to be used to measure outcomes for children. And obviously we've been working towards the harmonisation of background checking systems as well. Those are just some of the areas where there has been progress. It's slow because in the scheme of things, this is the first time that their states and territories have come together on these matters. But there is a goodwill and commitment, and I think there's a real opportunity to do more in that space.
As you know, the Royal Commission's terms of reference require it to concentrate on institutional child sexual abuse, with out-of-home care being an institution for those purposes. And the prevention of child sexual abuse, the enabling of disclosures to be made, the response of the institution to disclosures or allegations, and the support given to children are four important elements. Just dealing with the first, and given your experience in the current role, and I know your previous experience, what could you tell us about how systems that are currently in place could be improved to better prevent children in out-of-home care being sexually abused?
One of the guiding documents for my role is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Mm-hmm. And it very much emphasises the importance of the best interests of children, as well as children's right to be heard and to participate in decision making. And I think one of the critical ways that children can have their rights met, including to be free from violence and abuse and sexual abuse included in that, is to have good avenues to disclose what's happening to them and in these environments. So, and I think that's the point you're talking about now, disclosure, is it?
Well,
was that the first point?
It's not entirely simple to separate the four. Yeah. There's clear overlap. My question was about prevention, but if indeed you need to answer that with reference to the other limbs, please do so.
Well, I think that if children felt that they knew their rights, they understood their rights, and they knew where to go if they felt their rights were in danger of being breached, then that is actually quite a useful tool in terms of prevention, or at least escalation. Prevention, it seems to me, but it is also about self-protective behaviours. So if they feel that, invasions into their personal space and privacy is something that is a breach of their rights, and they should stand up, and they will be supported to do so by adults in the system, then I think that is a preventive measure in itself. However, we can't put it all on children to be, grounding the safeguards in the system. We really have to put it on the adults in the system. That means the people that run the services, the carers, and so they have to be very well chosen and very well trained, and we have to have champions out there around child safe organisations, not just in out-of-home care settings, but in every setting.
Mm. The information to give to children to enable them to speak out or understand how to be protective can be given in the way that Ms Simmons described, and there have been various other witnesses who've described ways in which that information can be given to them. What's your view on what is a better way? I'm not suggesting for a moment, Ms Simmons, that yours isn't a way of providing that information.
Well, most states and territories now have Charter of Rights for children in care. the extent to which these are made available, accessible, understandable across the jurisdictions is not known and is not something that's covered in the National Out-of-Home Care Standards. So for me, that is actually a large measurement gap. We don't know the extent to which these documents and what flows from them are actually that children engage in it, and we do need to be able to understand that, because this is the gateway to all other to realising your rights, is understanding your rights. Having been involved in the development of Charter of Rights in a couple of jurisdictions, the most important part of developing these is doing it with children, so that they're part of the design process and the implementation and distribution process. And for them, the important element was that carers understand it, that carers have a role in the education of children, that social workers and caseworkers have a role in the education of children, and also that children know where they can go to and who they can go to, and that there is somebody to go to. And I note that you had some young people addressing you earlier this week, which was just brilliant, as they always are. They always inspire, and it just does show the value of talking directly to children. And they were talking about the need to have advocates at various levels, and it seems to me we need to be thinking about how to get that right. There are the kinds of advocates and support persons that are sort of a less formal friend to a child, which is about connectedness and feeling that they have people to go to and that they can talk to people and they're not isolated. But there are also advocates like guardians or public advocates.
Like guardians, thank you, I missed that.
Yes, that have a more formal role in taking on that advocate role, and it can actually achieve system change. So, and sometimes children want that as well. And I think that's really important, that we deliver agents in the system that focus solely on their rights and interests, that don't get distracted by the system's needs, that can hear their voices and that actually can affect change for them.
The evidence received so far suggests that an intermediary is needed between a guardian's organisation and the child. So the child is very unlikely, it's age appropriate obviously, but a child as opposed to a young person is very unlikely to ring an agency like the Guardian. What the evidence has been is that they need a mentor or someone perhaps they trust closer to their age, or a teacher or the like, to be the person who then takes responsibility for speaking with the more formal structures that you operate. And mentoring has been suggested as a way of providing that. What do you think of that?
Well, there's lots of evidence that suggests that these young people don't have trusted adults or mentors in their lives, and that's a pretty critical thing. One of the problems with that kind of model is you really don't want to introduce more instability into a child's life. You don't want to introduce somebody who's going to be their trusted mentor and friend who stays for 6 months and is off again, because that's their experience generally. That's part of the reason they're disempowered and that they don't speak and this is part of their experience, is this instability and sense of being let down and betrayed all the time. So I think we've got to be very careful when we talk about these programs, and that's why if you have an office that's a stable statutory role, whether Pam or others could employ hip, groovy people to, as part of those sorts of offices that children feel comfortable with. But, it's not my experience that children can't talk to adults of all sorts of ages. They just need to know what it is that the relationship is and how they can, and how they can be helped in that role. I think if you demonstrated that, I think you could probably engage children. I think it's just a matter of creative marketing, really.
Well, sticking with the issue of preventing, Ms Simmons, what do you think?
I just think we've got such a long way to go yet. Beyond procedural measures, I think a lot of what we can answer is the sorts of things which are procedural. So they are the screening and the background checking, it's the having child safety policies in place that you can point to, it's having the child safety officer appointed. But, you know, the hardest things I think that organisations have to do is also arguably the most important, and that is having an organisation that really can demonstrate and is open to listening to children and having them participate in the organisation, because that doesn't just make a difference for the children in whether they're prepared to disclose about whether abuse has happened or whether they feel uncomfortable, but it also means it's an environment for adults who will feel comfortable to raise issues or concerns if they have them. And so we've just got still a long way to go, because that's so much about organisational culture. So when we go and have a look at an agency and we look at policies and procedures and that they are doing all of that right, you can't be sure that that is an organisation that will prevent child sexual abuse if it's not an organisation that is also very open from top to bottom in both its philosophy and its approach and its openness to hearing from children and having them participate in the major decisions that affect them. Those are the sorts of things that we've got to be looking for in organisations if we're talking about prevention of sexual abuse.
But it's the case, isn't it, that a number of the processes and policies go towards culture. It's not only having them, but the content of the policies and the extent to which there might be complaints or issues arising in the institution or the organisation. That all tells you something about culture, doesn't it?
What it tells you is that they've taken note of that and they do have those procedures in place. What you then want to do is go to ask other sorts of questions other than, can I see your child safety policy and code of conduct?
But you accept that's part of culture, but it's not the entire answer to culture.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry, I was not dismissive of the procedures by any means. I think they're absolutely important, imperative. So that's really important. But I think the hardest part for change is still in how do we as an organisation operate differently? What is it that we're doing now which might prevent children from coming forward if they feel uncomfortable? And it's not just coming forward if they feel uncomfortable, it's coming forward with ideas of how this organisation is run. It's coming forward with ideas of what are the sorts of things they like and don't like. It's all of that organisations have to be able to demonstrate that they can do. And you know, good organisations will be able to do that and show how they have the mechanisms for listening to children and how it changes, how it has changed what they do as well.
And the traditional measures for determining matters of culture have been the presence and content of policies and procedures, the absence of complaints and the like. What other measures should we be looking for to see whether or not the culture of an organisation providing care for children is doing the right thing?
If you were looking, can I perhaps choose one environment, a residential care environment? What you'd be looking for is, firstly, that there were both formal and informal means of a child providing feedback to the agency. So it would be suggestions boxes. It would be making sure that children, and we would ask the children, do you know how to, if you wanted to talk to the manager about something, do you know how you go and how you would do that? And that they would understand what that process was if they wanted to either make a complaint or to provide some feedback or to say if they were unhappy with somebody senior in the organisation. The other thing you might be looking for is what we call residents' meetings, which sounds very formal and perhaps institutional, but the best residences do it by once a week around dinner, we'll sit and talk about what are the things you're happy about here and what are the sorts of things you'd like to say to the supervisor. And it's encouraging that sort of engagement, active engagement of children. It's also making sure that children have at least one person in the organisation who is special to them. So whether that be a key worker or a caseworker or somebody who they know and who they trust and know, who they can go to if they are unhappy, distressed, or feel at risk. So it's really, those are the sorts of things that you would look for. And you'd ask the organisation how you do that, and you'd ask them also, and how has that brought about change? So in other words, what has been your response to that feedback? And then you'd ask the children. So, you know, what is it that you do that this organisation asks of you that you've seen make a difference? You do those sorts of things just to make sure that that is embedded in the organisation.
Thank you.
And are you seeing that happen?
I have seen it happen. And it's magic when it does. And so I know it can be done. And that's what inspires us to say to other organisations, these are the sorts of things that you can do. And they are the sorts of things that we'd be moving towards if we were to have truly child-safe organisations. So it certainly can be done.
And are you seeing that happen across a minority of agencies, or about half of them, or what sort of percentage?
In those agencies that we know of, it's still a minority.
Ms. Boland?
I suppose in New South Wales we have a number of systems which we think interconnect. So there is obviously the screening system and now the carers register, and their objective is to screen out unsuitable people to work with children. I think the interface then with the accreditation system is particularly important, because I think that's when we do get to some of the issues that both Pam and Megan have spoken about. And I did think about one thing one of the young people said about reliability, and I think it goes to everyone's heart about somebody not turning up when they're expected to. We all feel uncomfortable about that, but that would be parcel of the home care experience. And I suppose using that reliability trigger, it did remind me about some work that we've done in our office about high reliability organisations and what they look like, and how close do our out-of-home care designated agencies come to high reliability organisations. And I suppose the thing that characterises them the most is, I think, just mindful leadership with behaviour that sends a message that child safety and child outcomes are the absolute priority over other business priorities. And if you put that test across any designated agency, any perhaps CSC or whatever, that would be at a high level a test. And then you have a range of, I suppose, systems that interconnect. So in relation to our screening and our carers register, I mean, in the screening area, and I know that you've done quite a lot of work on the Working with Children check. The Working with Children check in New South Wales, the new one, has been in place for 2 years. It's screened over 750,000 people. And out of that, there's been a number of people. But I think the most interesting statistic that is emerging, it goes to child-safe organisations, is that for 1 in every 5 of the bars that we have in place at the moment, those people have had no previous record whatsoever. And it really, it just heightens the, I suppose, the urgency about looking at child-safe systems, and I think that's where our accreditation system fits squarely in making sure that the screening instruments that are in place are not the only tool that's used, but what else is in place to ensure safety, that organisations are fundamentally reliable and safe for children.
When you say haven't had a record, you mean a criminal record?
Any record.
Disciplinary?
Any.
No complaint? Why have they been barred?
Because, we have a system in place, and again it's a preventative system, which after you've been given a clearance, we have a continuous check event, which is we get any matters coming to us which occur subsequent to the check, and that 1 in 5 is the figure I'm talking about. A subsequent event has happened after a clearance.
And that event may be criminal, civil, disciplinary?
They're mainly criminal.
They're mainly criminal.
It can be. The figure I'm talking about are bars. There's another figure about interim bars. So we get other information where we put an interim bar on, for example, a reportable conduct that was of concern.
So the criminal activity, let's say it's a charge for the moment, has to be a charge that's relevant in some way to working with children.
Yes, it has to be covered in the schedules of things that we look at.
Thank you. Now, I understand you haven't finished, Ms Boland, but given the time...
Yes, we'll take the mid-morning break for 20 minutes. Thank you.